Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, we have sanctions, and more sanctions from Russia to Venezuela. We're also going to talk a little bit about how the economy is affected by the plummeting oil prices and a little bit about arms trade. Right now, it seems like the world is in a topsy-turvy condition, and it's also in a state of confusion. Well, we start our broadcast off today with a surprise when an Abilene couple was given the shock of their lives when a truck crashed into their house. According to police, an elderly woman failed to stop at a stop sign and collided with a pickup truck, and that impact sent the pickup truck careening into their house. As the homeowner prepared for supper, she said, "I heard a noise and it was like crash, boom." Little did they know they were going to have an unexpected visitor crash into the bedroom of their house.
Well, so how are these low gas prices affecting everyone? While we may be enjoying the lower prices at the pumps, some countries are feeling the pinch because of the cost required for them to produce a barrel of oil. Now, 10 years ago, the price of oil was in the mid-50s. Just 5 years ago, in the lower 80s. And 1 year ago, it had topped a whopping $100 a barrel. And now, in 2014, we're back into the 50s. Now, of course, every barrel of oil can produce big dividends for Canada, and they have a lot of it. 168 billion barrels of oil in reserve. Only Saudi Arabia and Venezuela have more oil reserves.
Oh, I didn't realize Canada had that much reserve. That is a lot. Now, in Canada, over 500,000 jobs are related to the oil sands alone. For every one direct oil sands job, there is one indirect and 1.5 induced. The question is, are those jobs at risk? And how vulnerable is the Canadian economy? Well, analysts say that even though some consumers might benefit from the low oil prices, the negative ripple effect would come in over $1 trillion in oil investments that will not take place, which will also affect jobs related to the oil market. So we're going to see that come back in a bad way for that industry. Economists are saying that ultimately for Canada, this is a negative.
Wow. Well, we now turn our attention back to the United States and the recent policy shift from President Obama regarding Cuba. Now, that policy change was met with mixed emotions from Cuba to Washington, as the move is to undo the deep freeze in their relations that has lasted for decades. Now, Cubans welcomed renewed diplomatic ties with the United States. Now, some citizens of Cuba said that these new ties are going to help the economy grow following the 54 years of revolution. That they say that this is the best for our people. Now, one Cuban citizen said, "Cuba and the U.S. have never been enemies. There were just some of the political issues that were out of place, and now there are steps. These steps to help this situation are long overdue."
There was never animosity between the two people.
Right.
So, right. Well, that's great. Well, now this shift in U.S. policy will ease economic and travel restrictions on Cuba. Some of you might be wondering why the change now. Well, this grew out of more than a year of secret negotiations facilitated by the Vatican. That's right, the Vatican. Pope Francis offered his congratulations, referring to the two nations making this step forward in relations. And not everyone is excited about the new deal, even expressing their disapproval. One such person was Florida Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, who expressed his concerns of a lack of demands for the Cuban government to meet, such as freedom, elections, and the release of political prisoners. The word around Washington is that the House and Senate is working to block the president's actions, but the White House dismissed the possibility of Congress trying to block those actions. Now, even though the House and Senate would have to vote to repeal the trade embargo on Cuba, the White House press secretary said that the president has done all that he can do. Now we're waiting on congressional action to remove the remaining restrictions, and they think that that's going to just actually take place.
Well, MasterCard, Cisco, Marriott, Pepsi, Caterpillar, and Major League Baseball have lined up to start doing business in Cuba. Although the process won't be overnight, Cuban residents are excited to do business with the U.S. It's been 54 years since restrictions were enacted. Now, Wayne Smith was a U.S. diplomat who helped close the U.S. Embassy in Cuba in 1961. He was just in his 20s at the time. He spent a lifetime working on U.S.-Cuban relations and said, "We haven't gained anything in 50 years. Why keep repeating the same old mistakes year after year? And it hasn't achieved anything. It was time to change, and finally, sensibly, it has."
Kind of like kicking a dead horse, you know? Well, President Obama recently said in an address at the White House, His Holiness Pope Francis made an appeal to me and to Cuba's President Raul Castro. It was also stated that the U.S. will again operate an embassy in Havana and that travel restrictions will be eased. Although these discussions have been in the works for over a year, things intensified once the Pope wrote a personal letter to both the leaders of the United States and Cuba, and they actually got together and had several meetings throughout this time period. And in fact, one of the meetings that the U.S. and Cuban officials held was actually there at the Vatican.
Well, in October, a senior Vatican official met with both parties. Officials say that the Vatican is the best place for negotiations to take place, as secrecy is the lifeblood of the world's smallest and possibly the most leak-proof state. Now, this announcement came on the Pope's 78th birthday, and some say a very fitting present for the world's first Latin American Pope.
Yeah, first in over 1,300 years. That's amazing. Well, while one country rejoiced over pending relations with the United States, another rallied against it. In Venezuela, many people gathered in the nation's capital to hold a rally against recent sanctions imposed on the country by the United States. Sanctions include confiscation of senior official properties and freezing bank accounts in the United States. Venezuela President Maduro said, "By no means will this government, as a sovereign nation, bear the U.S. hostilities."
Well, President Maduro also said Venezuelans should collect signatures to repudiate the move and throw American visas into the garbage. A man who is in opposition to the Venezuela government said, "For me, Venezuela is a nation that has the most corrupt government due in part to its complex democratic structure." Maduro denounced those allegations and expressed his desires for the Venezuelan parliament to organize lawyers and campaigners to take the U.S. to international court for violating human rights.
It's like there's a lot of frustration going on right now. Now, the Venezuelan government has denied any official properties in any place out of state or in state, and that these sanctions are completely political in nature. And many people denounce Washington imposing sanctions on officials of a sovereign nation without any legal reason to do so.
Now, in France 24 exclusive interview, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov agreed that current UN sanctions are hurting the Russian economy, but Europe as well. He mentioned Vice President Joe Biden, who admitted it was the United States which ordered Europe to join sanctions against Russia, pointing out America's powerful influence over those European countries.
A lot of leverage there. Continuing on the topic, Mr. Lavrov stated confidently, "I can assure you Russia will not only survive, but will come out stronger out of this. We have been in much worse situations in our history than this, and every time we were getting out of these fixes much stronger." When asked if he was concerned Russia would experience an economic meltdown, he quickly denied this possibility, saying, "Never."
Now, as if the already imposed sanctions weren't enough, President Barack Obama has put his signature on a bill which, among other things, gives him authority to impose new sanctions on Russia. The White House said signing this legislation does not signal a change in the administration's sanction policy, which we have carefully calibrated in accordance with developments on the ground and coordinated with our allies and partners. And they stress that, allies and partners,
right,
meaning it's a collective group there putting these sanctions on Russia.
Interesting. Now, the bill, also known as the Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014, authorizes the president to spend $350 million worth of arms and military equipment to Ukraine and use $20 million annually to promote democracy in Russia.
While the president may never use these new powers, the sanctions already set in place over Russia are quite extensive. Under those, some of Russia's largest banks and firms are not allowed to borrow money in the West for more than 30 days. They also ban certain exports to Russian defense and energy firms.
Now, just one day after President Barack Obama signed this new bill into law, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov gave a stern warning to his American counterpart in a phone call made by the Secretary of State, John Kerry. Mr. Lavrov made his point clear when he reportedly warned the legislation was threatening new sanctions against Russia, which would undermine the possibility of cooperation between the countries for a long time, thereby almost, basically saying the bridges were getting burnt here.
Well, President Vladimir Putin also discussed the Russian economy during his annual end-of-the-year 3-hour news conference, in which he vowed that his country's economy and the ruble will bounce back within 2 years. Now, Russia's ruble took a nosedive recently, losing over half its value in the past year and sending Muscovites hurrying to the stores to dump their shrinking rubles.
Well, it seems like those in the government in Russia seem to be pretty confident that this is something that's going to blow over a period of time. Yeah, and that's what they feel like. Well, Putin blamed Russia's economic woes largely on external factors such as the plummeting oil prices and, of course, Western sanctions over Ukraine. But he defended the takeover of Crimea, saying it was like a Russian bear protecting its territory. The Russian president stated, "Sometimes I think maybe it would be better for our bear to sit quiet rather than chasing around the forest after piglets, to sit eating berries and honey."
Now, the president continued, maybe they will leave it in peace, but they will not, because they will always try to put him on a chain, and as soon as they succeed in doing so, they tear out his fangs and his claws. Now, by fangs and claws, Putin said he meant Russia's nuclear weapons, which are protecting its valuable natural resources.
Well, standing up to the West over Crimea has stoked national pride. A recent poll showed that President Putin's popularity is at 81%, extremely high there. And concerning the economy, President Putin did not have an outline for any plans or policies. However, he did suggest focusing attention on diversification, which was lacking. He said, also, much of what was planned to be done and what we said should do hasn't been done with regards to diversification of our economy over a period of nearly 20 years.
Well, to offer more insight on the current state of affairs Russia's economy, YPN's Larry McGee has our coverage on Russian inflation, the EU, and the indiscriminate sale of Western arms. Now, Larry, what sort of moves are we seeing come from the Russian bear to try to offset the conditions being created by the Western sanctions, which are restricting their ability to buy and sell? Larry?
The move, which is gaining much attention at this point, is the Russian central bank, which increased a very important interest rate to 17% in a move designed to strengthen the Russian ruble. Elvira Nabiulina The governor of the nation's central bank says, without a doubt, the situation is very difficult and it requires absolutely coordinated actions on behalf of the government and the central bank, and they are ready for such coordination. Since January, the ruble is reported to have lost 60% of its value, producing inflation and creating much hardship for Russian citizens. Oil, of course, is one of Russia's chief exports, and it is severe decreases in oil prices which are being fingered as the culprit behind the ruble's devaluation. Despite all the recent developments, President Putin has remained confident, stating in a recent interview that the modern world is very interdependent. But that does not mean that the sanctions against Moscow and the sharp drop in the price of energy commodities and the national currency devaluation will have negative results or catastrophic consequences for Russia only. Nothing like that will happen, Putin said. Still, the Russian president's words will be put to the test as President Obama is scheduled to sign yet more sanctions into effect this week, further restricting the ability of the Russian bear to buy or sell. Fellow members of the quartet, the EU, were also in headlines this week after convening for their last summit of 2014. As has been typical for previous gatherings throughout the year, Russia and Ukraine were the primary focus of the leaders' attention. New sanctions were signed to penalize Crimea for its choice to rejoin Russia, with all EU-registered firms being prohibited from conducting business with Crimean companies. Analysts propose that the anti-Russian agenda is being driven by the U.S., but in the EU, it is the other great army of revelations, the Roman British Empire, which is taking the lead. And speaking with regard to the summit, British Prime Minister David Cameron commented that on the issue of Russia and Ukraine, we also had a very good discussion and unanimous agreement we should keep those sanctions in place, keep the pressure on Russia until it changes its behavior and stops its aggression in Ukraine. On the other hand, the Russian government categorically denies being responsible for the uprising in Ukraine, and the Kremlin maintains that the sanctions will not cripple the Russian economy. And offering a few words of insight concerning the conflict, President Putin recently conveyed to an audience of Russian patriots that the West had an anti-Russian stance long before the current crisis started. It's not payback for Crimea. It is the cost of our natural desire to preserve Russia as a nation, a civilization, and a state. They won't leave us alone. They will always seek to chain us. While Western sanctions might be causing a decrease in the value of the Russian ruble, what is assuredly not decreasing is the amount of revenue being generated by the global arms industry. The industry last year had an estimated worth of 325 billion euro. That's 45% more than in 2002. The United States and Britain are the biggest suppliers of weapons. 2/3 of all military hardware last year was manufactured in the U.S. and Western Europe, along with Italy and France, who also received significant shares of the market. Artie Florent, arms trade expert and author of the SIPRI report from which the current data was taken, says that industry transparency, especially on the level of international sales, is an issue. It is very difficult to see where the money is going. Earlier reports indicate that corruption in the global arms trade is worth 16 billion euro annually, with the leaders or kings of the nations, like America, Britain, and France, being regarded as the most morally bankrupt suppliers, in that they will sell their manufactured weapons to anyone for the right price. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, Larry, if the president does impose those new sanctions on Russia, it seems that it would finish off their already crippled economy. Well, don't get caught up in the soon-coming nuclear wars. Contact the House of Yahweh today and request your free edition of the latest copy of the Prophetic Word and monthly newsletter. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494 or visit them on any of their websites at www.yahweh.com, www.yisroelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can email them at info@yahweh.com, and for any calls outside the United States, please call the number on your screen.
Well, don't go anywhere. Up next, another enlightening message from Yeshua Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.